Wow, what a wild ride it has been. If you've been keeping up with us in Who's Who of the Bible, you've reached our last character study. Today we're going to be introduced to the story of Hosea. And man, Hosea is this guy that has a crazy story. And so if you're tuning in for your first time, you've tuned in for a pretty crazy encounter with a man named Hosea. So Hosea, once again, like a couple characters that we've studied, has a whole book of the Bible named after him. And so Hosea is a minor prophet. In the organization of the Bible, he's the first book in the minor prophets. And the minor prophets aren't minor because they don't have a big truth, but they're minor because the prophetic book is a little bit smaller. Because believe me, once you're done hearing the story of Hosea, you'll realize the truth he has to share isn't a minor truth, it's a major truth. And so when we encounter God in this story through the life and the love of Hosea, I think we can be encouraged to shape our stories in a way similar to Hosea's story. So have you ever felt like God was trying to teach you a lesson? Sometimes we're okay with being taught lessons, even though it hurts, because we're the ones learning the lesson. When I was in 7th grade, I was so excited. I was finally able to try out for the football team. I'm from Texas. Football's huge. This is what kids dream of, is getting to go out for the football team. But I had an elbow injury reserved for the age group of 65 plus. It's like a 12-year-old. And I wasn't able to play that year. And I remember talking to my mom about it because I was a little disgruntled. And I'm talking to my mom about it, and I'm telling her, Mom, this sucks. Why we gotta allow this? And my kind of disapproval of what God was working on in my life comes out. And my disappointment, I was making known my displeasure with God to my mom. And she tells me, she goes, sometimes, Caleb, shepherds had to break their sheep's legs in order for the sheep to stay near. Now, I didn't like that as a kid. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Why would a shepherd do that? That's not cool. But I think sometimes when I was God's metaphorical sheep in this circumstance, God was breaking my leg. Can I say for certain God was doing that? No. But I knew that God was up to something. And often the events that happen in our life are God trying to teach us something. And Hosea's life was a little bit different than that, but similar in a way. And how does my story of my little broken leg, my broken elbow, connect to the story of Hosea? Because sometimes God teaches us lessons through our difficulties, but in the story of Hosea, God would be teaching others a lesson through Hosea's difficulty. That's much harder. Would you accept difficulty in your life so others could learn a lesson? That's what Hosea had been spoken to by God, that God was telling Hosea to do something that was hard. And in the story of Hosea, we run across God's word coming to Hosea. And he says to Hosea, go take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. Did you catch that? God is having Hosea, the prophet, take for himself a wife who would regularly commit adultery with other men. Can you imagine a challenge like that? Not only would she commit adultery, she would have 2 sons by other men. That's what Hosea was being called to. Surprisingly, Hosea obeys God because Hosea walked with God. He was near to him. And Hosea, in obedience to God, gives us something to be in awe of. That when God is asking Hosea to be obedient in this moment, he is obedient in this moment. Now, Hosea's wife, Gomer, and for lack of better words, Gomer spends at least a portion of her life prostituting herself before other men. And you would think that Hosea would be let out of this marriage by God. But God was going to do something else. Remember, God was teaching a lesson through Hosea's life. And as a prophet, that's not usually how it worked. As a prophet, Hosea typically got to proclaim God's message through his words. But not with Hosea. Hosea's message came through how he lived his life. All of this happens in Hosea's life in just 3 chapters. What could God be teaching us about our own stories through Hosea's stories? Hosea's story is meant to change our story. That's the whole story of God. Is God's story is reconciling us to himself. So what do we learn from the story of Hosea? Hosea is a person chosen by God to be a picture of God's unending love, grace, and mercy for Israel through how he loves his wife. That's Hosea's story. You have to remember that Hosea was a prophet. And like I said just moments ago, prophets proclaimed their words, their messages through their words, not through their lives. But Hosea was proclaiming God's message through his life. And God, through Hosea, was loving Gomer and reminding Israel that in the same way that Gomer was chasing and orienting her life around other gods, other men, that Israel had aligned its life around the other gods, other nations, other allegiances. And God was saying, I've been chasing you down in the same way that Hosea has been pursuing his wife Gomer. Hosea was living this big picture truth that God's love pursues us relentlessly. Hosea's life teaches us that God's love is deep. Hosea in chapter 11, verse 8 tells us that God's heart recoiled within him, that he had compassion that grew warm and tender for Israel. Do you see this picture coming alive? This picture of God's compassion and tender heart recoiling within him? Does this message align with the message of your life? I think that's what Hosea's story is asking of us. Is the life that we're living a message of God's relentless love? Truly, if people were looking at your life, would they say they're seeing the mercy of God recoil within your heart? Within my heart, does the mercy of God, the compassion of God, grow warm and tender within my heart? That's what Hosea, loving Gomer, tells us and challenges us on. Because in the same way that Hosea pursued Gomer, God pursues us. Christian, does your life look like Hosea's? Christian, does your life show the watching world that God is pursuing them? Non-Christian, the story of Hosea is a call to trust in Jesus, to trust in God's redeeming love. God in his mercy has bought you back. In the same way that in Hosea's story, he goes and he finds Gomer indebted. And she was indebted to another man who she was arguably prostituting herself with. And what does Hosea do? Rather than just saying, hey, you got yourself into it, get yourself out of it. Hosea leans in and purchases Gomer out of this bondage. Hosea purchasing Gomer is what God did for us in his son Jesus. Through sending Jesus, God showed his love to us through his son dying on the cross so that we might receive righteousness, so that we might receive and get to live in a different reality than what we deserve. Non-Christian, Linger under the love of God in the life of Hosea. Return. Seek the Lord while he may be found. That's what Hosea is saying, is be a Gomer. Be a Gomer in the sense that you return to the Lord to receive his goodness. That's it. That's it. That's our final story. Or that's, in this case, the finale of the story of Hosea. If you've watched from beginning to end, this is our 10th story. And this story can change our life as much as the others. As we orient our stories around Hosea's story, our story becomes much more about living out the love of God than living it out through our words. Because I think sometimes it's actually easier to speak like a Christian than it is to live like a Christian. And Hosea's life is reminding us that though God often calls us to proclaim his words, he also calls us to live his words. So in Jesus, we have seen the movement of grace draw near to us through his covenants. But also in the lives of these Old Testament characters, we have seen God move near to people in the rhythms of grace. Jesus, where Adam, where Noah, where Abraham, where David all failed, Jesus didn't fail. Jesus succeeded. Jesus, being fully God and fully man, made a way for us to know the Father. This Jesus who came, he invites us into a relationship through which we can experience the movement of grace in our own hearts and change the rhythm of our hearts, orienting them around his story of righteousness, his story of gracious redemption, of drawing near to us. That can be our story. Draw near to the lost Christian, non-Christian, draw near to the Lord. So as we come to a conclusion, I want you to know that in the Bible there's a movement of grace. We can see that in the first 5 characters we talked about. But there's also a rhythm of grace. In the same way we can see the waves of the ocean are being moved by a current we can't see. We can see the movement of God's grace moving through the rhythms of grace in the lives of these men and women we've talked about. And I believe that God's grace is moving towards each of us through Jesus. And when it moves closer to us, there's only one question left. Will we receive God's grace?